one that listens. So Solomon actually immediately asks for a listening heart. And with that listening heart, he will be able to discern between good and between evil and to do justice among God's people. Yeah?
Yeah.
It's down in verse 12. God responds, Yahweh responds, he says, hey, good job, because you haven't asked for things for yourself, right? Like wealth, like riches, like fame, like the heads of your enemies, though he may get all of those things. You've asked for something that is greater, and it's that listening heart. And then God goes on to define what a listening heart is, and it is a lev hakam, a heart, a wise one. And this is the clearest definition in the Bible that I'm aware of wisdom, if that makes sense. So I know there's the passage in Proverbs, like the beginning of wisdom is the fear of Yahweh. But here we have God saying, a wise heart is a listening heart. And I think the implications of that are astounding. Because wisdom is predicated not on what we think we need for ourselves, right? Or what we think our community needs. And Beau, you were talking about this earlier when we were talking, and you should riff on this a bit. Mm-hmm. It's not what we think, what I think you all need, but wisdom comes in hearing people out and then making a decision. What's cool about this passage, this chapter, cool, is cool still cool to use? I forget.
Yeah, you can still say cool.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. We can, like, we're in that small grouping that, yeah.
That is cool.
It's still cool to say cool.
Yes, okay. So you remember the second half of chapter 3, after Solomon asks for a wise heart, the author then demonstrates what that means. And you have the two women coming before the king, which actually in and of itself is astounding, because you have two women getting being able to present their case before a king, which would seem to be unheard of in a patriarchal society, but there you have it. And there are also women who are identified as prostitutes. So, and the king embraces them, receives them, and the debate is whether or not the child who died was this woman or that woman's. And remember that Solomon listens to their arguments, and then he says, we'll cut the child in half. And of course, the real mother, like any real mother, says, no, don't do it, let her have it, while the false mother, you might say, says, go ahead and cut it in half. And in that process, Solomon is able to determine who was the true mother. And it says at the end, all of Israel was astounded by the judgment of the king. And they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. It's actually, they saw that the wisdom of God in the Hebrew was in his approach to do justice. This idea that he approaches people, he encounters people, and that is the decision that he makes.
Oh. Yeah, as you were talking, Brendan, I was reminded of really several things. One being that just a few short weeks ago, when we started a series through the book of James, the first message being, when times are tough, pray for wisdom. So very recently, this particular group in our congregation has been challenged to not simply pray for something to be over with, which I think is the first inclination we have when something's not going the way we want it to do, is to pray for it to be different or over with. And yet James' challenge is, okay, when things are tough, pray for wisdom. I love that story, and I love the sequence of events, because we can spend time on each of those, but I kind of like how things come together for the community in that narrative, right? You've got the inauguration of a king, which is obviously kind of a fresh start. And Brendan and I were talking about this earlier, and we'll get to kind of what fresh starts looked like in Israel. But oftentimes, the inauguration of a king in many cultures is a fresh start time. Like debts get reset, and properties are either, I guess if you're the conqueror, you get everybody else's property. But if you are, the victor in something where you're getting to keep your own land, you get to keep your own property, and kind of the spoils of the inauguration traditionally would go to the people, kind of giving them a fresh start, so to speak. But here, in asking for this listening heart, which is not for the self, right, then ends up being for this very particular kind of situation between these two women, which in of itself, you're absolutely right, is, and I'd never actually even considered that before, how revolutionary that in and of itself is, right? That you have two women of ill repute welcomed into the royal court. I mean, that really is kind of unheard of. And yet, in having asked for a listening heart or wisdom, apparently the court is open, right? But in addressing something really specific to these two people, the entire kingdom is then astounded by, presumably, at least at the start. I mean, Solomon kind of goes sour after a while, right? But at the start is this, wise and selfless king. Upon his inauguration, all the people are in awe. Which is, I mean, it's just such a hopeful story.
And it changes that kind of posture of, I think, of resolution making from what do I need to partially what do I need, but what do I need because it's impacting another person, right? And so, yeah, Beau, I can tell myself I need to lose weight, but that doesn't work well unless, and obviously there are more serious things, but unless it's Kristen's asking me to lose weight, and so I'm going to go to the gym or whatever it is, right? Yeah. And then the other thing is listening, going back to that shame and hope. The only way I am able to break out of the cycle of shame is when another person says to me, you are not inherently a bad father. You're a good father who makes serious mistakes sometimes. It's hearing the voice of the other person, because I can't tell myself that. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about this in Life Together when he talks about confession. He talks about the discipline of confession. And as great as the Presbyterians are, they have lost the discipline of confession that the Catholic Church still embraces, although it's probably too narrow in the Catholic Church. And Bonhoeffer says confession in one's own room in isolation and solitude is essentially fruitless, because it's us speaking to what we hear as God, but it's oftentimes our own voice. And it's much easier to do that than to go in front of a person and confess to that person and say, this is what I have done wrong. Gosh, you probably all have had to do that once in your life. I know I have, and that is the worst, one of the worst things, right? That's horrible. And yet, if you've experienced that, if the person with whom you're speaking is a forgiving person, is an embracing person, the release that you felt, right? When that person says, I forgive you, you're not bound by that sin anymore. You're not bound by your history anymore. That is the most freeing experience, liberating experience that one can feel, or one of the most liberating experiences. But that only comes through the voice of the other person. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer calls that voice the grace of God. It is God's voice, and it's a grace that God has given us for us to hear the forgiveness of another person. And then we think about our own society at large, right? We have a lot of people telling us what we need. And don't we just wish that some of our politicians would listen a little bit more? Isn't that what they're supposed to be? Representatives of our voices, yeah. So I wonder if we talked about, for one type of resolution, what if we started resolutions again, just took seriously this idea of how do I become a better listener, more receptive to the voice of others.
Which is a great segue into talking about Jubilee, but I want to hear from people. But I also, you reminded me, Brendan, did you ever have? Did you end up taking preaching courses when we were at seminary, or were you just?
Yeah, I had to.
Yeah. Did you have James? Did you have James K?
Yeah, but I've heard, yeah.
Oh man, so he is. I assume he is still, or he grew up in at least, a part of a tradition. I want to say it's an offshoot of the Friends movement. And maybe some of you are familiar with this and have heard of this, and you can correct me if it's not Friends, which is kind of like Quakers-ish. But they did public confession each Sunday. It was only the men, as a, incredibly conservative denomination. It was only the men, but I've often thought of instituting this in our Sunday worship services. All the men come forward and speak aloud all the mistakes they made the previous week,
especially to their significant others.
And
so not a congregation of all women.
Yeah, I know exactly. We'd have a congregation of all women very quickly, very, very quickly. But but as he shared this was a preaching professor at Princeton. As he shared this, he did kind of talk about it as being sort of this double-edged sword, because as you say, in a community of trust and in a relationship of trust, of course, confession can be incredibly powerful. Public confession can be incredibly powerful. And in our tradition, we have public confession, but it's always really kind of blasé. It's like things that anybody could have ever done wrong ever. And then we have a moment of silence to kind of bare our hearts to God, which, of course, you can choose to do with that what you will. But he did share with us as his students that there were times where it was incredibly freeing to publicly confess to the community what had gone wrong in the week prior, and to seek the forgiveness of the community and of God, and reconciling relationships. It was also, he confessed of kind of oppressive at times too, as you can imagine in any community, because all Christian community is broken, and we use things against each other that we shouldn't, and all that kind of stuff. But as you were sharing that, I remember him talking about that, and at the time, now I almost appreciate it, but at the time just thinking, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard of in my life. Like, whatever denomination you belong to, I don't ever want to go anywhere near that. I do not want to talk about what I did wrong last week, hardly in front of anybody. But I think, and sorry for that kind of tangent there. I want to hear people's thoughts on this idea of a different kind of resolution, a selfless sort of resolution, a praying for wisdom, which is defined in this context as a listening heart kind of resolution, and how some of you think that might impact your own life, or impact, let's say we did have leadership that was resolved to be about those kinds of things, and what kind of differences might that make? John.
Yes. Since you've been talking about James and doing a couple of sermons on James so far, referring to what Brandon said about the book of James, when you think of the book of James is only 5 chapters. And chapter 1, verse 19 says, quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And then you talk about New Year's resolutions, and I've had some challenges this last year, and I've got challenges this year. But taking James chapter 1, verse 19 to heart is one of my personal resolutions in dealing with a variety of people that I have to deal with, including my wife. Okay. And seriously, but that is true. And I just think that if we all would take that seriously, including our leaders, and if Congress would read that every day when they start their sessions, would it make a difference? And certainly we as Christians at First Presbyterian Church can take that charge seriously into our community. I think we could help begin some sort of reconciliation in our community and in our nation.
Yeah,
I
I appreciate. Yeah, absolutely. Sue.
I agree. I have been thinking a lot, as I'm sure all of us have over this last week. And I mean, I really think we all say, oh, I hear you, but we really don't listen. And we may listen, but we're more interested in what our answer is going to be than hearing what we're listening to. And I agree totally. I think that is a huge step that we have lost. That's a skill that we as a society have lost. And I think it's happened over a long period of time, but I think the culmination has been happening, not just within the last week, but within the last 4 years even. We just don't listen to what people are trying to say. And sometimes the biggest part of the solution is just letting them say it, because then they feel heard. And I think that's one of the objectives of listening, is to let the other person feel that they've been listened to, that they've been heard.
Amen.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Brendan, I saw a lurch. No, I'd have to agree with that. And especially, letting people be heard. Not to say that it shouldn't go past that or beyond that, but I remember having to make some really difficult decisions around a campus ministry center at my previous calling. And there were students involved in these decisions, but there were also kind of the power brokers of the presbytery involved in these decisions. And it was a pretty kind of, I guess the best way to describe it is incredibly uncomfortable, because there was a part of me that sought to protect the student body that I was ministering to from some of the, and it wasn't always ugly, but there was, John knows this, there are ugly parts of presbytery.
Amen.
And so I was in a room, and I would say at least 2 of the representatives from presbytery were people that I was very concerned of what they might say. And at the end of the day, the students all had all sorts of ideas for this campus ministry center, but at the end of the day, a couple of their ideas, they didn't pan out, they didn't work out. And I apologized to one of the students and said, I'm really sorry, because I thought your idea was fantastic, but it's just not going to work. And he just goes, well, that's okay, because I felt heard. And I was like, that's wonderful. I'd been carrying that around with me for the entire day, that I felt like, we were dismissive of your idea, and we weren't, it was that the idea didn't work. It wasn't that were dismissive. We didn't work, and he felt heard. And there's something really powerful when, you don't get your way or whatever, but you feel as though you've been heard. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Hey, Melody, did you
Oh, go
I
ahead.
have a thought. Sorry. Melody, did you have a thought before?
No, but it has left the building, so it's all right.
You sure?
Yeah, I'm good.
Because I want to listen.
No, you're good. I honestly
I
do
know,
not
I'm
remember.
He's trying to cultivate a listening heart.
Yeah. Well, I lost it listening to you, Beau. So
Yeah. Okay, there you go. Yeah. My words of brilliance and wisdom.
That's why
Sandy.
I need this, because my mind is like,
Yeah, I get
Yeah.
it. Sandy, what were you going to say?
Well, for several years, I worked in home health and went to people's homes. And I quickly learned that the best way to get their trust and getting in and helping them was by listening. And I didn't have to solve a lot of their problems. I couldn't solve all their problems, but by listening, that gave them some confidence that I knew what they wanted. And it was very, very successful. And it was very, very hard at times just to listen to some of the things they said, because I really disagreed with them, on the inside. But letting them know that didn't help anything.
Yeah.
So I learned and listened and helped where I could, and then just listened where I couldn't help. The
Yeah.
other thing that I found was in making my resolutions, I sometimes made the wrong resolution. I mean, like instead of wanting to lose weight, I started saying I want to be healthy.
Yeah.
And that made a big difference in how, I mean, I lost some weight. I didn't lose all of the weight. I still could lose more of it, but I did become healthy. So sometimes I think we need to just rephrase that some way, in maybe a more positive attitude with it or something. But it made a big difference in my life, and I'm still working on it. I think you can't resolve some of your resolutions in 1 year. I think it takes a little bit longer, because I didn't get those problems in 1 year either.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of ideas that I've had.
Yeah. Yeah. I like it.
that's a good connection. I think it was John that brought up the slow to anger, and James, is that right? Because what keeps us from listening, Sandy, is when people are talking about things and you feel your blood begin to boil. I know that well, right? And it's just like, I can't take this anymore. And the funny that if you go to that passage in 1 Kings 3, the back and forth between the two women, right? It's like bickering. And you can imagine that I've got better things to do. I don't need to hear this, right? There's no sense of tension in Solomon's voice. He's calm. He says, okay, let's cut the baby in half, and it's just astounding. So I agree with that. Think about that, how our frustration gets in the way of listening. I know it myself.
Yeah. Melody, did it come back to you? Or is this a new?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Yes, via Brendan. I appreciate that. But yeah, so I was just thinking, one of the things that has helped me most in times when I've had disagreements with people, I guess, is the relationship with the person that I have is way more important than me winning the argument. And that has just changed how I go about listening in arguments and conversations and stuff like that. And it immediately kind of turns an argument into a conversation and helps me listen a little bit better. So,
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Melody. One of the things that it's like almost a mantra that I've been telling myself, but I've also been sharing with others that I see you know, you have that like amygdala response, you know, where it's like chemistry that we're, you know, we tense up, we come forward, we make ourselves big, we, you know, we do all these things, and it's quite a bit of work to figure out ways to control that response. But one of the things that I've been saying over and over again is people above politics, because I feel like it's been so reversed lately, and political identity has become so much higher than personal identity, and I'm not sure you can achieve any kind of health that way or have meaningful relationships in that way. Um, Not that they're not important, or I mean, not that politics isn't important, but that the people that you might disagree with are human beings first, and their ideas of how things should work comes, you know, probably pretty far down the line after that, to be honest. Well, any other ideas or thoughts before yeah, Carol, jump in.
Hi. Well, I've been thinking over the last couple of weeks, especially the last week, a lot about freedom of speech. And it made me think about in the corner of Hyde Park in London, there's a speaking post, and anybody can just stand there and speak and say anything they want to. And we could say, well, in this country, every corner is a speaking post. People can say anything they want to, with certain limitations, but virtually anything they want to. And so I've been turning that around in my mind and asking myself, I wonder what it would be like if we had a listening post where, and I've been wondering if this could be a role of the church. It just seems like the church has some real potential at this time to do things that perhaps maybe we used to do and we haven't done for a long time, or things we haven't done before because of the rolling crisis we find ourselves in. And so it just occurred to me, what if we had one of those little 3-foot high sandwich boards that would announce the listening post is open, and then various members of the church could take turns and could be a listener, an active listener, a sincere listener, but someone who would allow people who have something to say that needs to be said, a safe place to do it. That's my thought.
That's great, Carol. You know, I was a pastoral counselor for 30 years. And most of that time I was in churches. And believe it or not, listening post was often coming up from the lay people and the pastor. They'd say, this congregation or this community needs a listening post. And I remember that very well. And I don't know if I fulfilled it, but my practice was always inside of a church building.
Right.
I think that idea.
Well, I'm thinking like, yeah, I was thinking more like Maslow, more listening, not really offering solutions or perspectives or, you know, nothing personal from the listener, but just taking it in. Yeah.
And you know what? My biggest claim to fame is I had more sessions where I didn't say one word than anybody else in the group practice.
Right.
That can be taken any number of ways, but Cheryl, I think that's a fantastic idea. I think I've typed it over in the chat section here just so I can remember it, a listening post. I mean, on a symbolic level, I wonder if, and I want to get into some other Old Testament stuff here, but on a symbolic level, I wonder if the church shouldn't resolve to be a listening post, you know? Um, but on that physical level, as you mentioned, you know, an actual like, hey, let's go set up a sandwich board on the corner of 12th and 3rd, and or on the corner of Main and 12th, walk down the street and a folding chair, and just, hey, if you got something to say and nobody's listening, we're here to listen, and we will just listen. And that's it. We'll listen, and when COVID's over, we might give you a hug, but that's it. And be done with it.
Not anytime soon.
Not anytime soon. I mean, yeah, unfortunately, but well,
Hey, Beau, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, jump in.
Just really quick to highlight one other point from that passage. I do like the fact, David, that you were a listening post. I like that. The human listening post. Solomon asked for a listening heart in order to discern between good and evil. I think another thing that we have to fight against is this notion that good and evil are defined things. So I think that we could probably point out several things that are inherently evil, right? And I think we could point to several things that are inherently good. But a lot of stuff, it's contextual, right? And this is Ecclesiastes 3, which is considered a wisdom book, where the author, where the poet goes between these opposites and says there's a time for this and there's a time for that. And the wise individual knows that what was good here is evil here. And so just as much as we fight our anger, maybe part of our anger that wells up within us is this need, somebody was talking about need to be right. And when we've already defined what is good and is evil, if that gets subverted for us, our concept of reality and rightness is torn down, and I don't like that, speaking for myself. So how do we also cultivate within us that sense of, yeah, what I thought was good at this point and what may have been good at this point is not so good. Think about politicians, how they're critiqued so often for flip-flopping. Mm-hmm. It's not I mean, sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. Different times call for different actions, and to hold somebody to their word that was spoken 6 years ago, or to their vote that was cast 6 years ago in a completely different era 10 years ago, is unfair. It's unfair. That's my last word. You're up.
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, I kind of wanted to end our time this evening. I mean, we can continue to discuss, but I kind of wanted to bring up, by way of talking about resolutions, talking about the church, talking about you know, just kind of how we tend to you know, and I'm making fun of myself a little bit on purpose, because I think all of us do these things, but we do these incredibly kind of, you know, self-serving type resolutions that, you know, are based on some kind of shame cycle, or, you know, it's like, I think we're all guilty of that to one degree or another. And I may as well confess than I am. But one of the things that I observed as we move from 2020 into 2021 is that I'm not so sure, you know, I sensed, and maybe you sensed it too, that kind of a sort of disappointment that in these last 2 weeks, that we thought 2020 was over and 2021 was going to be better, and so far not so much. And I think there is kind of a cultural disappointment. And what I think we're missing is, as is alluded to in the First Kings text as well, is we have this kind of individualistic type of resolution model. And so I wanted to offer for us as a church a different idea of hitting the reset button, which I think we actually mentioned a couple times ago in a road trip discussion, but it's called the Year of Jubilee, which which is kind of like the Jewish reset. It's kind of like everything's going to everything's going to be better because we're going to kind of reset and do better from here forward. This is a little brief description from Leviticus, and then I might turn to Exodus as well, because there's some really cool implications for what happens here. You just got to get to the right page. In the year of Jubilee, you shall return every one of you to your property. When you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not cheat one another. When you buy from your neighbor, you shall pay only for the number of years since the Jubilee. The seller shall charge you for the remaining crop years. If the years are more, you shall increase the price. If less, diminish the price. For it is the certain number of harvests that are being sold to you. You shall not cheat one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. You shall observe my statutes faithfully and keep my ordinances, so that you may live in the land securely. The land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and live on it securely. Should you ask, what will we eat in the 7th year? And the Jubilee is either 7 times 7 years, so on the 50th year, or there's also Sabbath years, which are every 7 years. It's kind of unclear as to if is Jubilee every 50 years or every 7 years. But should you ask, what shall we eat on the 7th year if we may not sow or gather a crop? I will order my blessing for your 6th year, so that you will yield a crop for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will be eating from the crop until the 9th year, when its produce comes in, and you shall eat the old. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me, and you are but alien tenants throughout the land you hold. You shall provide for the redemption of the land. It's basically a big reset for creation, and a big reset for finances. And then here in Exodus chapter 25, is it chapter 25 or 21? Give me one moment. It's also a big reset for human beings. And we don't have to talk about the practice of slavery in the Old Testament, although we could. But when you, these are the ordinances that you shall set before them. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th year, he shall go out a free person without debt. So kind of this, as we set dates, we've kind of set them arbitrarily, and Brendan had that wonderful historical story of how we ended up with January 31st. The Bible has this same kind of concept, but it's a community concept. The entire community is resolved to set people free, reset debt, let the land rest, and kind of take a break, so to speak, and rely on God. In another passage, I thought it was really interesting. And I can't remember if it was Leviticus or Exodus, but there was the question of, well, what if about having enough food on one of these Sabbath years? And there was even kind of an identification process with the poor, where, well, you'll be gleaning from the fields, and in that way you'll identify with those who glean all the time. And so as a part of resetting the community, and kind of hitting the refresh button, there's even this sense of, for those who have wealth, taking a year to identify with those who are poor in their community. So was someone going to jump in? Brendan, was that you? Never mind. I guess I'm just kind of fascinated by the idea of resolutions, and further by the idea of what would it mean to be a community that is resolved to do something this year, rather than just, like me every year, I'm going to lose the weight or whatever it is I might say I'm going to do, that I don't ever do, by the way. at least not for New Year's. But what would it mean to be, and we just got done with this series through the liturgical year, which is kind of a whole sort of pattern, you know, that we have, a tradition of patterns for the church. And I'm just curious what people think about, you know, what would it mean and what would it look like, and what kind of shape or form could it take for First Presbyterian Church to say, you know what, in 2021 we are resolved to.
I want to just bring up something. I got really disgusted with a couple churches that hired me to help them.
But not this church, right?
I don't belong to this church, so
Okay.
and those were anyway. That wanted me to help them create their mission goals and go through a process of discernment about their situation, their context, their neighborhood, all those things. Look at all that stuff, and then start making a statement. And you know, they were interesting meetings, but we never got down to talk about who is in the room. And that was what I missed the most from the side of my work, which was counseling, to consulting with churches who were trying to, you know, they had good reasons to try to think of what their place is. But I walked into this church when you guys were in the middle of that huge study. What was it for the presbytery? Anyway.
Oh, the consultancy process. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if anybody else felt, I wasn't in that, so I'm sure it was edifying, but I think you are asking, I'm answering by saying, I don't think it should be something like what I'm describing.
Yeah, I think you're thinking of something a little bit more complex than what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
Yes, Euless.
Have you ever thought in reverse in some ways? Our church has had a year of Jubilee come March. We haven't been able to be in the sanctuary. It is a total reversal of what we've done ever since that structure was built.
Yeah.
And I don't like that thought that it's a year of Jubilee, but it has brought about changes, some changes which aren't bad, like what we're doing tonight. We're meeting on Zoom. We're learning about technology. We're learning new mediums. We're learning new ways of telling people our love for Jesus, and with a little more time sometimes to really think about what he is doing every day to make this a better place. And out of all the chaos and the bad, there is always hope. And I got my vaccine last week. I mean, you have to keep looking at stuff that is there in front of you and saying, hey, am I listening?
Yeah. No, it's absolutely occurred to me, Euless, that this is a like a forced year of Jubilee. And not just for our church, but you know, like the air quality in Los Angeles has improved tremendously because not as many people are out on the roads. I mean, there's been some big resets and refresh button type stuff that we just wouldn't have done otherwise. I'm always curious about, you know, I think one of the things, you know, David mentioned the consultancy process, which I think went really quite well. But one of the things that I think I learned from that is that oftentimes we are achieving ministry goals accidentally. And so, which is wonderful, because what it means is that, you know, God and the Holy Spirit are working in and among us.
Amen.
But wouldn't it be nice if we reached ministry goals with intentionality, at least, you know, some of the time? And so, you know, that was a big part of.
Pride.
Say it again, Euless.
Isn't that pride? I mean, it's nice to have goals, But when
Intentionality.
we think we are doing it, I think that's pride.
Well, I don't know that we'd be self-congratulatory. I'm just talking about intentionality.
Okay.
Yeah. But other ideas around a church that is.
Well, I wouldn't say, she was saying that isn't that pride. I would say it a different way, and that is the way it's been, the way it happens as you described before. We know that's God working among us and the Holy Spirit working among us. If it was all intentionality and we accomplished some stated goal that we had set, and in the way that we set, would we then feel like it was us that did it?
Oh,
rather than the work of God doing it.
I suppose you could. Yeah. I would guess that you could. Yeah. I kind of want to push back on that a little bit, though. Are we accidentally a church?
Mm-hmm.
I think the Lord has provided in all different kinds of ways. And one was property in Arizona.
Sure. Yeah.
That an accident? I mean, he's busy preparing us, but we just have to sometimes say, hey, that's really good. I call it my Jesus blessing every day. Hey, that's really good.
Yeah.
And it's not bad to have goals. We couldn't be on Zoom if we didn't have a goal. But what everybody's discussing and the ideas that people come from, that's God's planning, not us.
Others. It's interesting. I feel like I struck a chord by saying as a community, we could resolve to do something or be something. That fascinates me. I feel like maybe it's our red-blooded American individualism that's like bucking this, going, no way, no.
Well, I think
we don't do things together. Cheryl.
Oh, Cheryl, you have something to say. Good.
Yes. In response to the comments, I guess I'm of the notion that God gave us a brain to think with, and if there are needs in our community or the surrounding area that we can think about and come up with a plan and somehow impact in a positive way, is that us doing it? I don't think so. I think God gave us a certain ability to think and act that is from Him. It's not us. It's what He gives us and works through us.
Amen.
This is
The stumbling
yes,
block.
Barb.
Well, I would like to see maybe the churches work together closer as a body rather than denominations, where possibly the ministry teams or whatever meet and find out what's going on, or when we do something, if we choose a project, we put it out to the other churches for their congregations. I just think the powers of numbers and what you can get accomplished, and we all are doing it, for Jesus. I mean, it's then you can kind of accomplish some things rather than doing little bits, which are good for a day or whatever, but it can have a bigger impact.
So resolve to be ecumenical.
Well, you can choose however you want, how you want to run your service and stuff. But yeah, aren't we one church?
Last I counted, there's like 50 of them in Durango. So
They're just different sites.
I know what you're saying, Barb.
I know.
David, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just a stumbling block for any of this when you get into the community and goals and resolutions and mission is the agreement process.
Mm.
Um, finding ways to agree, whether it's budgetarily or theologically or how whatever, is where we just stumble and stumble and stumble. I mean, I love Barb's idea. I mean, I wish we were an ecumenical town a lot more, but yeah, I mean, my life is because I'm married to a priest. But anyway, I just wanted you to know that I worry about I worry about, or I stumble upon the agreeing process.
Yeah.
That shows its head almost immediately
Mm.
when you post something.
Well, and there, David, I'm glad you said that, because there, Euless had brought up pride earlier. If we're intentional about what we do as a church, are we being prideful because we take credit for it?
Mm.
But I don't see pride creeping up in intentionality. I
Right.
see discernment creeping up in intentionality and listening and trying to carry out what God is directing us to do. Where I see pride creeping up is exactly where you've mentioned it, which is where churches get so stuck, is in that agreement process, right? That's where pride starts to reel its head in my observation.
Yes,
Yes, Barb.
What about, well, instead of dreaming up stuff, think of all the programs that already exist in the city where we know about it, but we don't really advertise it too much. We may not have a strong MANA presence, but there may be people in our congregation that would like to know, when else they could go. When we do a project, do we get the fraternal organizations involved? Like some of them already have, solar, supply trains like for solar for down in the Navajo, I mean, how that could relate maybe to Newcomb or whatever. I mean, I'm just thinking there's a whole lot out there that we just don't tap.
Yeah. Definitely. Brendan, were you going to jump in there? I thought I saw you. No. Well, I wonder, I appreciate everything, all these ideas. I guess what I wonder is, could it be a little simpler than that? Like, we're going to be resolved to listen, rather than trying to, I think what we try to do sometimes, and we try to create programs or make sure that we've got our fingers in every nonprofit here in Durango or wherever. And I wonder if it could be more restful than that almost, which is kind of what I like about Jubilee so much, is, they're not resolved to go out and do something. They're resolved to give it a break, give it a rest. Yeah, that's kind of where I was leaning with it, but I appreciate what everybody said. And I really appreciate that there was some kind of chord there when I said, hey, could we as a community come together to achieve something? It's interesting though, and we're going to wrap up here pretty soon because I know it's getting kind of late, but it's interesting that Martin Luther King Day, we're celebrating on Monday, right? And clearly, here was a Christian with some intentionality who had to get a community to agree on not just an understanding, but also agree on a practice, right? And it was a nationwide movement. And when it wasn't working, they had to re-strategize and all sorts of stuff. But I don't see pride there necessarily. I just see effectiveness and God working through everyday people to non-violently bring about significant change. So it can be done.
that can that be our next topic? Nonviolent social change as part of the church.
Yes. Yes, because Brendan and I will disagree on that.
Wait until Patrick's the guy who carries around a gun.
Oh, that will be so much fun because we all three of us have not widely variant opinions, but we don't necessarily see completely eye to eye. So that could be a lot of fun.
In 2 weeks
Yeah.
or whenever Patrick
Yeah.
can come.
Yeah. Well,
Right.
maybe not in 2 weeks, but we'll check in with Patrick.
Okay. I'm gonna leave.
What do you think, Brendan? Would that be a good one to do? Yeah. Yeah. Brendan is a staunch pacifist. I'll tell you that right now.
I'm a warmonger. I'm a hawk.
All right.
Oh,
people.
man. We'll have to check our amygdalas when we talk about
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah, seriously.
Well, hey, everybody, thank you so much for being here. This was so much fun, and I'm so glad you're all here. I wish you all well and a wonderful night. And I realize it's getting past my bedtime. So
Yeah.
God bless and much love to you all. And we'll check in again soon, and we'll have Patrick here with us next time. We'll see.
Be well.
Be well.